In The Courage to be Free, Florida's Blueprint for America's Revival, Governor Ron DeSantis shares his background, leadership philosophy, and Florida's approach to various issues. DeSantis, a Yale and Harvard Law School graduate, served in the U.S. Navy and Congress before becoming governor. He prioritizes the people of Florida over the leftist elite, despite facing opposition and media criticism. Florida's economic and educational success under his leadership has led to a significant shift in voter registration, with more than 300,000 more registered Republicans than Democrats. DeSantis criticizes the ruling class, which he believes holds most Americans in contempt and wields power through an unaccountable administrative state. He advocates for populism as a counterbalance and discusses Florida's stance on education, immigration, crime policies, and media. DeSantis also shares personal anecdotes from his childhood and experiences at Yale and Harvard Law School that influenced his political views. Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, shares his background and leadership philosophy. A Yale and Harvard Law School graduate, DeSantis served in the U.S. Navy and Congress before becoming governor. He reveals that his experiences taught him to prioritize the people of Florida over the leftist elite. Despite facing opposition and media criticism, DeSantis implemented policies based on freedom and evidence, leading to Florida's economic and educational success. He also fought against critical race theory and woke gender ideology in schools. DeSantis' courage and determination earned him the support of Floridians and Americans alike, making him a winning blueprint for patriots across the country. As a governor, DeSantis took bold stands, fighting partisan media, entrenched bureaucrats, and powerful interests to protect Florida's freedoms and natural resources. His leadership inspired hope and pride in Floridians and Americans during challenging times. Significant migration to Florida since he became governor in 2018, with a notable shift towards Republican registration. Before his election, there were nearly 300,000 more registered Democrats than Republicans in Florida. However, by October 2022, Florida had more than 300,000 more registered Republicans than Democrats. This shift is described as the Great American Exodus, with Americans leaving states dominated by leftist governments and Florida serving as the promised land. DeSantis emphasizes that this is not a validation of the Republican Party or its establishment, but rather a response to Florida's agenda that reflects the values and common sense of the people. He also refers to the elites as a ruling class that has consolidated power over American society, controlling various institutions like the federal bureaucracy, lobby shops, universities, and media. These elites are progressives who believe in managing the country through an exclusive cadre of experts and wielding power through an unaccountable administrative state. They view average Americans with contempt and consider themselves entitled to rule over others. The term elites in this context refers to individuals who share the ideology and outlook of the ruling class, which can be demonstrated through their language and actions. The issue of populism and the unrepresentative ruling class in American politics. According to DeSantis, the ruling class, which includes establishment Republicans, corporate media, big tech companies, and government bureaucracies, has captured many leading institutions in society and created a de facto regime that crams its vision down the throats of an unwilling public. This dynamic has led to a uniparty system where most Republican voters, many Democratic voters, and a large number of independent voters are unrepresented. DeSantis argues that the desirability of populism lies in its attempt to counteract the failures of the ruling class with a more representative and successful government. He cites examples of the ruling class's failures, including the granting of most favored nation trade status to China, military adventurism without clear objectives, social engineering regarding home ownership, and the weaponization of the national security apparatus. DeSantis argues that the primary driver of political division in the United States is this ruling class, which holds most of the public in contempt, exercises power through a vast administrative apparatus, and maintains a sense of entitlement despite the myriad of failures it has left in its wake. Florida, according to DeSantis, has stood as an antidote to America's failed ruling class policies by empowering individuals and limiting the power and influence of large politically connected institutions. The response to the coronavirus is used as an example of the value of allowing every citizen to use their own common sense and bucking the experts' opinions. Florida's approach to education, parental rights, and pushback against woke ideologies. DeSantis criticizes the ineffectiveness of experts during the COVID-19 pandemic and the overreach of progressive elites. He highlights Florida's parental rights in education law, which enshrines parental involvement and curriculum transparency, and the state's leading role in school choice programs. Additionally, DeSantis addresses the threat of private entities, such as big tech companies, wielding too much power and influencing public discourse. He also discusses Florida's stance on immigration, law and order, and sovereignty. Overall, DeSantis argues that Florida has stood up for individual rights and freedoms against powerful institutions and elites. His vision for immigration, crime policies, and media in Florida. He advocates for a merit-based immigration system, focusing on assimilation and benefiting working-class Americans. Regarding crime policies, DeSantis emphasizes maintaining order in communities and achieving justice for victims. He criticizes rogue prosecutors and the media for spreading false narratives and vilifying those who stand up against the regime. DeSantis also mentions his foundation, built on faith and blue-collar values, which has helped him stand firm for what is right as the governor of Florida. He shares his experiences growing up in Florida and how his roots have shaped his perspective. A personal anecdote about his childhood dream of taking his Little League baseball team from Tampa, Florida, to the Little League World Series in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. Growing up in the greater Tampa area, DeSantis was deeply involved in baseball and spent most of his time within a 5-mile radius of his home. When his team, Dinan National, did not make it to the World Series, he was inspired by Dinan American, their crosstown rival, who came close to winning the title. The experience ignited a determination in DeSantis and his teammates to make it to Williamsport the following year. They dedicated their entire summer to practicing and competing, eventually winning the Southern Regional title and earning a spot in the World Series. The community's support and excitement were unexpected, and the experience of playing in the prestigious tournament was a significant milestone for the young athletes. He recalls competing in a Little League baseball tournament and the hard work and dedication required from both the players and their parents. DeSantis also discusses how his experiences took him around Florida and eventually led him to attend Yale University, where he encountered federal regulations and a significant culture shock. Despite the challenges, DeSantis worked hard to make the most of his opportunities and used his experiences to inform his political views, including his stance towards Taiwan and his appreciation for hard work and dedication. He describes his father's experiences growing up in Aliquippa, Pennsylvania, a town heavily influenced by the steel industry. The closure of the steel mills in the 1980s led to mass layoffs and the decline of the community. DeSantis also shares his mother's background from Youngstown, Ohio, where his grandfather worked for the Board of Elections and served in the military during World War II. Both regions, he explains, instilled strong Catholic values and a sense of hard work and American pride in him. Despite the differences in geography and culture within Florida, DeSantis' upbringing reflected the working-class communities in western Pennsylvania and northeast Ohio. DeSantis expresses his shock at the anti-American sentiments of some students, many of whom came from privileged backgrounds, and the rejection of traditional values and principles. He emphasizes the importance of common sense and level-headedness in leadership, and the dangers of intellectuals who are untethered from reality. DeSantis also criticizes Yale's ban on the Reserve Officer Training Corps and the disfavored treatment of Christianity on campus. Overall, DeSantis' experiences at Yale shaped his understanding of the political left and its rejection of the foundational principles of the American experiment. His experiences at Yale University and how it allowed him to see the future of the ideological dominance of campus dogma in American institutions. DeSantis rejected the idea of balancing academic achievement and athletic success, instead doing everything to the fullest. He worked various jobs around campus to make ends meet and ended each school year with only about $100 in his checking account. One day during his senior year, he was surprised when the athletic director, Hayward H. Hapstuper, urged him to hurry up and get to practice because former President George H.W. Bush was there and wanted to speak to the team. DeSantis was instructed to show respect and not use foul language in front of the former president. This encounter was a big deal for DeSantis, as it was the closest he had come to a president in his life. However, he was mistaken in thinking that Yale would provide a connection to a storied history and tradition, as it instead allowed him to see the future of the ideological dominance of campus dogma in American life. Ron DeSantis shares a personal anecdote about meeting President George H.W. Bush during his time as a college baseball player. DeSantis recalls feeling starstruck when Bush visited their team and expressed his admiration for the former president's humility and service to the country. He also reflects on how meeting Bush put his own experiences in perspective and inspired him to appreciate the sacrifices made by the greatest generation during World War II. Later in the video, DeSantis discusses how his college experience during the post-Cold War era contrasted with the challenging times following the September 11th attacks and his decision to serve in the military. Ron DeSantis shares his experience attending Harvard Law School and the political climate that differed from his undergraduate years at Yale. He describes the school as the command center of American liberalism, with a faculty dominated by critical legal studies, who did not seem to believe in the rule of law but instead sought to manipulate it for their preferred political outcomes. DeSantis graduated with honors but was not passionate about his education. He was intrigued by the military recruiting policy at Harvard Law School and decided to enlist in the Navy, earning a commission during law school and serving as a military prosecutor in Florida. His first assignment involved prosecuting cases in military courts, which were unique to the military and comprised solely of active-duty military judges and juries made up of officers and senior enlisted personnel. DeSantis enjoyed his role and handled cases involving various offenses, including sexual abuse, narcotics, fraud, and corruption. His life took a drastic turn just a few months into his military service. Ron DeSantis shares personal stories and experiences from his life, including his time as a Navy SEAL in Iraq and his experiences as a new member of Congress. DeSantis discusses his encounters with intelligence failures, mosque operations, and detainee operations during his military service. He also shares his thoughts on the impact of military deployments on soldiers and their families and the limitations of using the military to socially engineer foreign societies. In the latter part of the video, DeSantis talks about his decision to leave active duty service and write about American history and the U.S. Constitution. He also discusses the challenges he faced in promoting his first book and running for Congress, as well as his experience during his 2012 congressional campaign and his refusal to become part of the swamp culture in Washington. DeSantis also shares his frustrations with the political consequences of the Republican establishment's perceived disregard for conservative values and his role in creating the House Freedom Caucus to bring Republicans in line with voter preferences. Ron DeSantis shares a personal story about a fortuitous encounter at a golf driving range in 2006. DeSantis, who was new to the area and still learning to golf, noticed a beautiful young woman practicing her swing. Despite his initial shyness, he approached her, struck up a conversation, and discovered she was a local television news reporter. They hit it off and started dating, with their shared backgrounds in Ohio and military service providing common ground. The encounter led to a long-term relationship and eventual marriage. Meanwhile, DeSantis' first year on active duty was also going well, with his prosecution work and a voluntary deployment to Iraq with Navy SEAL Team 1. Ron DeSantis shares his experiences as a Navy SEAL during the Iraq War. He describes his rigorous training in Coronado and Fort Irwin, California, and his deployment to Iraq during the surge in U.S. combat forces. DeSantis explains that the mission was to decimate al-Qaeda while leaving behind a stable democratic and pro-Western government. He emphasizes the importance of maintaining relationships with the local population and avoiding civilian casualties. DeSantis also shares his role as a counselor to commanders and operators regarding the rules governing the battlefield, and his belief that operators should not be left with inadequate rules of engagement. He argues that providing adequate support to those putting their lives on the line is the least we can do. Ron DeSantis discusses his experience with military operations in Iraq, specifically dealing with intelligence failures, mosque operations, and detainee operations. DeSantis explains that intelligence failures could lead operators to the wrong location, and faulty intelligence would not justify disciplining an operator. Mosque operations required specific authorization due to the potential negative impact on the broader effort to isolate terrorists from the Sunni Arab population. Detainee operations were sensitive due to the aftermath of the Abu Ghraib prison abuse scandal, and detainees would frequently claim abuse to delay operations. The U.S. created a detainee operations apparatus throughout Iraq, with detainees preferring to be in U.S. custody despite claims of abuse. Interrogations were crucial for obtaining additional intelligence, and detainees could be released, sent to theater-wide internment facilities, or turned over to Iraqi authorities for prosecution. However, the Iraqi legal system was vastly different, featuring an inquisitorial system with unpredictable trial results and a lack of acceptance of testimony from non-Muslims. Ron DeSantis shares his experiences and lessons learned from his time in Iraq during the post-9/11 operations. He discusses the impact of the military's prolonged deployments on soldiers and their families, and the limitations of using the military to socially engineer a foreign society. DeSantis recalls being stunned when President George W. Bush declared the U.S. goal to be the end of tyranny in the world, questioning whether American liberty depends on the success of liberty in other lands. He criticizes the messianic impulse of promoting democracy by force and argues that the founders would not have supported such an approach. Instead, they understood the importance of a constitutional structure that protects liberty and prevents the tyranny of the majority. DeSantis concludes that it is a fool's errand to impose such a framework on foreign societies, especially those lacking cultural affinity for liberty. Ron DeSantis shares a personal story about his experiences after returning from a deployment in Iraq and getting married. He describes the feeling of relief and freedom upon returning to the United States and the challenges he faced in preparing for his wedding, including having his medals professionally mounted just in time for the ceremony. DeSantis then discusses his decision to leave active duty service in the Navy and begin writing about American history and the U.S. Constitution to contrast the founding fathers' intentions with the political landscape during the Obama administration. He explains that he wrote a book to fill a void and became an author due to his wife's new job covering PGA Tour events, which gave him more free time. Ron DeSantis shares his experience of writing his first book and the challenges he faced in promoting it and eventually running for Congress. DeSantis explains that the publishing industry favors established authors, and his first book, Dreams from Our Founding Fathers, First Principles in the Age of Obama, did not gain much attention or make the bestseller list. To promote the book, DeSantis and his wife, Casey, engaged in grassroots marketing, attending conservative political group meetings and selling books after speaking engagements. Although the book did not sell well, it helped DeSantis connect with conservative activists in Florida, who encouraged him to run for office. In 2011, DeSantis appeared before dozens of groups throughout the state, and the message of his book resonated with audiences. As the 2012 election approached, Florida gained 2 new congressional districts, and DeSantis saw an opportunity to run for the new seat. However, he faced numerous challenges, including a lack of name identification, no campaign funds, and established competitors. Despite these obstacles, DeSantis and his wife decided to take the campaign straight to the people by knocking on doors of likely voters and focusing on building relationships with voters in the Republican primary. Ron DeSantis shares his experience during his 2012 congressional campaign in Florida. He and his wife, Casey, adopted an effective door-to-door campaigning strategy, visiting thousands of households in their district. This approach allowed them to connect with voters directly, earn their trust, and address their concerns. DeSantis believes that this personal touch was crucial in his victory, as it distinguished him from other candidates and helped him understand the voters' priorities. He also acknowledges the frustration of GOP voters with their representatives in Washington and pledges to stay true to his values if elected. Despite his lack of political experience and the potential skepticism from voters due to his education at elite universities, DeSantis emphasizes his ability to withstand indoctrination and remain committed to his beliefs. The campaign's door-to-door efforts contributed significantly to his success in the primary and general elections. Ron DeSantis discusses the challenges faced by newly elected Republican members of Congress in draining the swamp in Washington. DeSantis shares his own experience as a new member and the pressure to conform to the established political system. He highlights the role of the media in amplifying Democratic messaging and smearing Republican policies, creating a warped perspective that permeates the Beltway. The media also functions as an enforcer of party discipline for Democrats and an instigator of dissension among Republicans. The entrenched D.C. political class holds a contempt for average voters and fuels a conventional wisdom that is often wrong. Federal campaign finance laws make it difficult for viable primary challengers to emerge, and members who reject the pressures to conform face a conundrum. They must first gain a position of authority to effect change, but doing so often requires becoming part of the system they aim to change. Ron DeSantis shares his experience as a member of Congress and how he refused to become part of the swamp culture in Washington. DeSantis explains that members who reject the swamp have little chance of ascending to leadership positions, and even those who try to play the game to climb the ladder often get neutralized once they reach seniority. He shares that he knew Congress needed reform and refused to go along with the Beltway game or fall in line with GOP leaders who were not honoring their campaign promises. DeSantis also chose to sleep in his office rather than rent an apartment on Capitol Hill and declined the congressional pension and health care plan. He believes that members of Congress should not be separate and distinct from the people they represent, and demonstrates this by declining the pension and health care plan, which was exempted from Obamacare for Congress. DeSantis also shares that he was able to get spots on the Judiciary, Oversight, and Foreign Affairs committees, which addressed important issues but were not considered powerful committees due to their fundraising potential. He ran for Congress to change Washington and not become a permanent member of the swamp, but in the modern U.S. House of Representatives, all the power is concentrated in the leadership, and very little occurs outside the preordained contours of what leadership decrees. DeSantis criticizes the massive omnibus spending bills that routinely get rammed through Congress, which are crafted through secret backroom negotiations between a handful of leadership and committee staffers and members. Ron DeSantis discusses the frustrations of new members of Congress in trying to influence legislation and the disconnect between congressional leaders and Republican voters. He shares his experience during his first year in Congress, specifically on the issue of immigration and the Gang of Eight amnesty bill. DeSantis explains how the process in Congress allows for limited input from members, and how the perceived political incentive and corporate desire for cheap labor led to the passage of the largest amnesty in American history. Despite opposition from the Republican base, the bill was put on the House floor for a vote, which would likely pass with a minority of Republican members and nearly every Democrat. DeSantis and other members worked to expose the flaws of the bill and pass legal immigration reforms as standalone measures, slowing down the momentum for the amnesty bill. Ron DeSantis discusses the political consequences of the Republican establishment's perceived disregard for conservative values, using the example of the defeat of House Majority Leader Eric Cantor in the 2014 primary. Cantor's loss, which came after his apparent support for amnesty for illegal immigrants, was a shock to the D.C. political establishment and a warning sign for the growing discontent among the Republican base. The failure of the Gang of Eight immigration bill in the wake of Cantor's defeat was a prelude to the nomination of Donald Trump 2 years later. DeSantis also recounts his own experience with the IRS targeting of conservative nonprofit groups and the lack of accountability for the agency's actions. The theme of the Republican leadership's unwillingness to effectively use their powers of oversight and to hold the bureaucracy accountable is a recurring one in DeSantis' time in Congress. Ron DeSantis discusses his role in creating the House Freedom Caucus during the Obama administration. DeSantis and a group of House colleagues formed the caucus to bring Republicans in line with voter preferences and block bad bills. The caucus, which included future Trump administration members, faced scorn from D.C. elites and the corporate media, but it put a significant roadblock in the way of the Beltway machine by highlighting the disconnect between Republicans in D.C. and their grassroots voter base. DeSantis also discusses his efforts to make an impact as a junior member of Congress, focusing on veterans issues and institutional reform. He authored the Puppies Assisting Wounded Service Members for Veterans Therapy Act to provide funding for veterans to receive service dogs as an alternative to the VA's preferred drug treatment. DeSantis also filed legislation to eliminate pensions for members of Congress, mandate Obamacare for them, and eliminate a slush fund for settling sexual harassment claims. Governor Ron DeSantis shares personal experiences that influenced his political career, from his time in Congress to his tenure as Florida's governor. He discusses his efforts to reform Congress, including proposing constitutional amendments for term limits, and his role in foreign policy issues, such as the relocation of the U.S. Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. Also reflects on his experience as a little-known U.S. representative running for Florida governor against a well-established opponent and the challenges he faced during the 2018 election. He emphasizes the importance of staying true to one's values and beliefs, even in the face of adversity, and the significance of having a strong team to execute one's vision. DeSantis also highlights the importance of executive energy in good governance and the potential benefits of his experiences as Florida's governor for a potential presidential run. Ron DeSantis discusses his efforts to reform Congress and his role in foreign policy issues during his time in Congress. He proposed constitutional amendments to limit the terms of Congress members and make laws apply to them equally, but they had no chance of passing. DeSantis also raised issues related to national security, including illegal immigration, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the need for a wall along the U.S.-Mexico border. He was particularly passionate about moving the U.S. Embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, which was a promise made by then-presidential candidate Donald Trump. Despite concerns from other countries, DeSantis led a mission to Israel to scout out possible sites for the new embassy and held a press conference to express his view that Trump would follow through on his promise. In December 2017, a subcommittee hearing was held to press for the embassy move, and Trump announced the relocation in May 2018. Contrary to experts' predictions, the move did not lead to a massive conflict but instead paved the way for the Abraham Accords, historic agreements between Israel and moderate Arab states. Governor Ron DeSantis shares an anecdote about the relocation of the U.S. Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem, which was met with opposition from experts who predicted it would be a geopolitical disaster. DeSantis argues that following the advice of these experts is a mistake and highlights the instance as an example of the bankruptcy of the bureaucratic expert class. He then discusses the need for term limits in Congress, explaining that the current system allows incumbents to maintain a grip on political power, making it difficult for new blood to enter the legislative process. DeSantis believes that term limits will incentivize members to address the issues facing the country rather than focusing on their own re-elections and will guarantee a steady stream of new ideas and perspectives in Congress. Ron DeSantis discusses the unexpected rise of Donald Trump during the 2016 Republican primaries. Despite the conventional wisdom that Jeb Bush, due to his name recognition and prodigious fundraising, would be the front-runner, activists in Florida showed little enthusiasm for another Bush presidency. Instead, they were looking for someone different like Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker. Trump filled this void by promising to address issues important to the Republican base, such as illegal immigration and American failures at home. Trump's unique star power, fame, and appeal to the base made him a formidable contender, despite opposition from the Republican establishment. This opposition was rooted in Trump's liberal past, his polarizing persona, and the fear that he would be a surefire loser against Hillary Clinton. However, DeSantis argues that Trump's nomination was not a hostile takeover of the Republican Party, but rather a longing for someone who rejected the old guard way of doing business and spoke to the concerns and aspirations of the base. Ron DeSantis discusses the Republican establishment's reluctance to support Donald Trump during the 2016 election, despite Hillary Clinton's unpopularity among voters. DeSantis recalls his experiences campaigning for Trump in 2016 and the resistance he faced from both the media and Republican elites. He also shares his skepticism towards the Russia collusion investigation, which he believed was a manufactured attempt to overturn the results of the election. DeSantis also shares a personal anecdote about his experience playing baseball in Congress and the excessive time and energy dedicated to the charity game, which he felt took away from his duties as a representative. Ron DeSantis shares a personal experience during a Republican baseball practice in Alexandria, Virginia, in 2017. While playing third base, DeSantis noticed a man asking Representative Jeff Duncan about the partisan affiliation of the players. After the practice, DeSantis and Duncan left the field, and as they approached their car, the man asked them the same question again. DeSantis found out later that the man was James Hodgkinson, who had shot and injured several Republicans, including Steve Scalise, the majority whip, during the practice. Hodgkinson was a supporter of Bernie Sanders and had a history of anti-Trump and anti-Republican social media posts. The attack was politically motivated, and Hodgkinson's goal was to massacre as many Republicans as possible. DeSantis expressed concern over how the media handled the assassination attempt, as they downplayed the political targeting angle and did not assign responsibility to Sanders or the political left. Ron DeSantis shares personal experiences that influenced his decision to run for Florida governor. He recalls a close call with a shooter during a baseball practice and the challenges of balancing family life with his congressional duties. DeSantis expresses frustration with the inefficiency of Congress and the missed opportunities to pass significant policies during the Republican government. With the prospect of having 2 young children at home while being in D.C. for half the week, he decides not to seek re-election to Congress. Instead, he sets his sights on the Florida governor's race, believing that the position would provide opportunities to enact reforms and make a difference. Despite the long odds and powerful opposition, DeSantis believes that winning the Republican nomination and the governorship is worth the challenge. Ron DeSantis shares his experience as a little-known U.S. representative running for Florida governor against a well-established opponent. DeSantis, who is not well known outside his district due to his role in Congress, relied on his loyal network of supporters and a major endorsement from President Trump to boost his name recognition. He believed that Republican primary voters were not mere followers but would analyze a candidate's record and philosophy before making a decision. Despite facing significant opposition from the Florida moneyed establishment and being outspent, DeSantis focused on reaching the necessary threshold of support to inform enough GOP primary voters about his background and platform. He earned an endorsement from Trump, which provided him with exposure to GOP voters across the state, and he was confident that many would see him as a good candidate once they learned about his record. DeSantis had developed a good relationship with Trump due to his support for his initiatives in Congress and his public defense of him against the Russia collusion conspiracy theory. He believed that after suffering through the Obama administration, they had a golden opportunity to get big things done with a president eager to sign bold reforms into law. DeSantis was one of the few Republicans who spoke out publicly in defense of Trump during the Russia collusion allegations and was respected by him for it. In late 2017, he asked Trump for a tweet endorsement, which eventually came, and he announced his candidacy for governor in early 2018. Despite facing false attacks from a shadowy political group, DeSantis' fundraising started to gather more steam, and he was bucking the prognosticators and consistently leading in the polling data. Ron DeSantis shares his experience during the Florida gubernatorial primary race against Adam Putnam. DeSantis describes how Putnam, with the support of special interests like the Sugar Corporation, ran false and compelling ads that portrayed himself as a strong conservative, leaving DeSantis struggling to respond due to lack of funds. The race had turned in Putnam's favor, with DeSantis losing by 17% in an NBC News poll. However, things changed when Fox News agreed to host a live debate between the two candidates, giving DeSantis an opportunity to define the race and highlight Putnam's differences with the GOP primary electorate. The debate, moderated by Brett Baier and Martha MacCallum, allowed DeSantis to showcase his strengths, particularly on immigration, and win over the crowd. The debate resulted in a dramatic shift in the polling numbers, with DeSantis gaining a significant lead, ultimately resulting in a 20% blowout victory in the primary election. Ron DeSantis reflects on the 2018 Florida gubernatorial election, which he considers the most consequential in the state's history. The election pitted DeSantis against Democratic nominee Andrew Gillum, who had won the primary despite being a relative unknown with unpopular left-wing positions. The media heavily favored Gillum, portraying him as the next Obama, and donations poured in from liberal strongholds. DeSantis, on the other hand, faced negative media coverage and personal scandals, including being found naked in a Miami Beach hotel room with a male escort and corruption charges. Despite these challenges, DeSantis refused to back down and counterpunched against the media's attacks. The political environment was also unfavorable for the Republican Party, with Democrats coming to the polls in full force and independents leaning against them. DeSantis trailed in public polling but believed he had a chance if he could get the expected election day turnout. The race was close, with DeSantis ultimately winning by a narrow margin. Ron DeSantis shares his experience of winning the Florida gubernatorial election in 2018. He recalls the uncertainty of the outcome as polls closed in different time zones, and how his life changed once he was declared the winner. DeSantis was now a protected person under Florida law, and his daily routine, such as taking a jog, was no longer private. He also shared a personal story about the baptism of his second child, Mason, using water from the Sea of Galilee that he and his wife had collected during a previous trip to Israel. Unfortunately, the plastic bottle with the remaining water was emptied and discarded by a member of the governor's mansion staff before they realized its significance. Governor Ron DeSantis shares a personal story about bringing water from the Sea of Galilee in Israel to baptize their third child in Florida. He uses this anecdote to illustrate the impact of his actions as Florida's governor, which can have repercussions globally. DeSantis then discusses the importance of executive energy in good governance, as outlined in Alexander Hamilton's Federalist Papers. He reflects on his own experience as a new governor, having never run a large operation before, but determined to be an active leader and advance key priorities for the people of Florida within the confines of the constitutional system. DeSantis mentions the limitations of the governor's powers in Florida compared to other states and the presidency, but emphasizes the significance of using every lever available to achieve policy victories. His powers as the governor of Florida and how they could be beneficial for the presidency. He mentions his line-item veto power, which could help prevent bloated and irresponsible spending bills in Washington, D.C. DeSantis also talks about his appointment powers, specifically his opportunity to appoint 3 justices to the Florida Supreme Court, which he did to return the court to a proper constitutional footing and reduce a roadblock to his legislative agenda. He also addresses the judicial environment in Florida and the mixed outcomes in the federal courts, acknowledging that some Obama-appointed judges represented a political roadblock but not an insurmountable legal one. Lastly, DeSantis emphasizes the importance of having a cadre of people who share his values and are dedicated to executing his vision, especially when staffing his administration in Tallahassee, where the challenge is to find individuals who can navigate the system without being beholden to it. Governor Ron DeSantis discusses his leadership style, focusing on accountability, loyalty, and effective teamwork. He shares examples of appointing individuals with opposing political views, such as former Florida House Speaker Richard Corcoran and Dr. Joe Ladapo, to advance his agenda. DeSantis also emphasizes the importance of setting the terms of the debate, fulfilling promises to voters, and transforming institutions, such as the Florida Supreme Court, to end judicial activism. Additionally, he discusses his successful education and environmental reforms, as well as his response to Hurricane Michael and the Parkland school shooting. DeSantis also addresses his stance on illegal immigration, sanctuary cities, and election integrity. He shares his concerns about the left's embrace of mob violence and the lack of political will to prevent it, leading to Florida's response to the Defund the Police movement and the implementation of legislation to prohibit defunding and increase penalties for mob violence. DeSantis also criticizes critical race theory, CRT, and the 1619 Project for distorting American history and exacerbating divisions in society. His leadership style and the importance of accountability and loyalty to the cause in his administration. He describes his former chief of staff Shane as a workhorse who ensured the smooth functioning of the governor's office and held agency heads accountable. DeSantis emphasizes the need for a reliable team and enforcing policies to maintain accountability. He also shares examples of appointing individuals with opposing political views if they would effectively advance the agenda, such as former Florida House Speaker Richard Corcoran as Commissioner of Education. Corcoran, despite endorsing DeSantis' opponent in the GOP primary, was appointed due to his extensive policy experience and reputation as a leading conservative reformer. DeSantis also shares the experience of appointing Dr. Joe Ladapo as Florida Surgeon General, who challenged prevailing narratives about COVID-19 and faced frequent media attacks. Ladapo's effectiveness in implementing evidence-based policies that challenged orthodoxy made him a target for NBC and CNN, but DeSantis views media smears as a form of positive feedback and essential to navigating the political battlefield. Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida discusses the advantages he had as a governor due to the size and geographical spread of the state, which made it difficult for other officials to gain statewide recognition. He also talks about setting the terms of the debate and fulfilling his promises to the voters. One of his major objectives was to appoint conservative judges to the Florida Supreme Court, which had a liberal majority for decades. Upon taking office, 3 liberal justices retired, giving him the opportunity to transform the court into a conservative majority. He interviewed candidates for the vacancies, including a friend from New York, Bob Jeffra, who had clerked for Chief Justice William Rehnquist and was a top litigator in the nation. DeSantis was looking for someone with no pre-existing allegiances to give him an unvarnished opinion, and he wanted someone who understood the proper role of the judiciary in the constitutional system. His appointment of justices to the Florida Supreme Court to end judicial activism and overturn a previous ruling that deemed school choice unconstitutional. The court's liberal majority had found the Opportunity Scholarship Program, which allowed low-income families to use taxpayer-funded scholarships for private schools, to be unconstitutional in the case Bush versus Holmes. DeSantis, as a candidate, promised to protect and expand school choice programs, knowing that the newly conservative Florida Supreme Court would be less likely to uphold the previous decision. He appointed 3 justices to transform the court into a constitutionalist majority and created the Family Empowerment Scholarship, a taxpayer-funded program with the capacity to grow and meet parental demand, to replace the Corporate Tax Credit Scholarship Program. The contrast between those who supported the initiative, including pastors, single mothers, business leaders, and the Latino and African American communities, and those who opposed it, including unions, affluent liberals, and the legacy media, was striking. His successful education and environmental reforms in Florida. He explains how his advocacy for school choice was part of a broader education agenda that included various options for parents, and how he enacted significant education reforms during his first term. DeSantis then shifts his focus to environmental stewardship, recognizing the importance of Florida's waterways to the state's economy and quality of life. He shares how he addressed the issue of algae blooms in the state's waterways by meeting with President Trump to request the Army Corps of Engineers to manage Lake Okeechobee in a more balanced manner, resulting in fewer discharges during the rainy season. However, this change was not enough, and in his inauguration speech, DeSantis laid the foundation for further waterway restoration efforts. His bold actions to restore Florida's waterways and hold government officials accountable for failures, using the Parkland school shooting as an example. Upon taking office, DeSantis issued an executive order to reorient Florida's water policy, appointed independent members to the governing board of the South Florida Water Management District, and proposed historic funding for water quality infrastructure and restoration. When it came to the Parkland shooting, he viewed it as a catastrophic failure of leadership that demanded accountability. Despite public pressure to enact firearms restrictions, DeSantis campaigned against them on constitutional grounds. He suspended Broward County Sheriff Scott Israel for the department's failure to stop the shooter and investigate previous calls about him. The sheriff challenged the decision in the Florida Senate and lost. DeSantis also petitioned the Florida Supreme Court to convene a special grand jury to investigate school security failures, leading to the resignation of the superintendent. Throughout his tenure, DeSantis emphasized the importance of accountability for government agencies and fundamental rights. His response to Hurricane Michael in Florida during his first term in office. After the storm hit in 2018, DeSantis requested a 100% federal reimbursement for 45 days and a 90% reimbursement for every day thereafter to aid in the recovery efforts. He met with President Trump in the Oval Office to make the request, but faced opposition from Acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney, who was fiscally conservative and hesitant to spend taxpayer money. Despite this, DeSantis was able to secure the president's approval for the increased federal assistance, which represented up to $500 million in additional aid. Governor Ron DeSantis recounts his experience securing federal funding for Hurricane Michael relief and his stance on illegal immigration and sanctuary cities. After Hurricane Michael hit Florida, DeSantis announced that President Trump had approved his request for 100% reimbursement for storm recovery costs, despite White House staff disapproval. DeSantis had previously distinguished himself from his primary opponent on the issue of illegal immigration, promising to reject sanctuary cities in Florida. He believed it was essential for public safety and the rule of law, despite opposition from some in the legislature. The ban on sanctuary cities was popular among Hispanic voters, contrary to the common belief that they favored open borders. DeSantis' election as governor was a close race, and the Senate contest between Rick Scott and Bill Nelson was still undecided, with tallies in liberal counties still in flux. His efforts to improve election integrity in Florida following disputed election results in 2018. He mentions that large Democratic vote margins were reported in Palm Beach and Broward counties after Election Day, leading to mandatory recounts and a chaotic situation. DeSantis promises to take election integrity seriously and takes action to ensure new leadership in those counties. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit and many states made unconstitutional changes to their election procedures, Florida stands firm and follows the laws on the books. The state is able to count 99% of its votes by midnight on election night, contrasting other states that took days or even weeks to count their ballots. Florida tracks voter turnout in real time, allowing anyone to monitor the ballots being cast throughout the day. DeSantis' early actions on election integrity paved the way for further reforms, including banning ballot harvesting, strengthening voter ID requirements, and establishing a voter integrity unit in state government. These efforts, along with legislative victories in education, healthcare, immigration, deregulation, and a budget with strong reserves, make for a successful first term for DeSantis. His approach to collaborative governance and leading offensively. He shares how he worked with legislative leaders to achieve big results with minimal conflict, citing healthcare reforms and infrastructure projects as examples. DeSantis emphasizes the importance of getting legislators invested in the success of the agenda and frames debates to his advantage. He also talks about the importance of taking a proactive stance on issues, even if they go against the prevailing narrative, and shares his experiences with standing up for law enforcement and election integrity. DeSantis recounts how he responded to Black Lives Matter protests in Florida, backing municipal and county law enforcement and deploying state resources to maintain order while respecting peaceful demonstrations. He also shares a personal experience of dealing with a violent protest at the governor's mansion. Ron DeSantis shares an account of the violent protests following the death of George Floyd and the resulting damage to communities across the country. A family, including Casey and her children, experienced firsthand the chaos as their house was targeted during the protests in Florida. The demonstrations led to significant property damage and over 2,000 police officers assaulted or injured, with deaths approaching $2 billion. The political response to the riots included efforts to defund the police, which resulted in a spike in criminal activity and a reduction in public safety in cities like Seattle, Minneapolis, and San Francisco. The defund movement was driven by leftist billionaire George Soros, who poured millions of dollars into district attorney races to elect far-left candidates. These prosecutors, once elected, prioritized social justice over law enforcement, leading to a calamitous impact on social order in these cities. DeSantis views the Floyd riots as more than a one-off event and is concerned about the left's embrace of mob violence and the lack of political will to prevent it. In response, Florida passed legislation to prohibit local governments from defunding the police and to hold rioters and looters accountable. His response to the defund the police movement and mob violence during the BLM riots. He explains how some local governments were prone to enact radical policies, and Florida took swift action to prevent defunding and increase penalties for mob violence. DeSantis also addresses the issue of bail for rioters and looters, stating that swift and strong accountability is the only logical response. The legislation he signed increased penalties for mob violence and prohibited bail until the first appearance in court. Despite media outrage, the results showed that the penalties served as an effective deterrent for lawlessness. Additionally, DeSantis capitalized on the decline in law enforcement morale by establishing a recruitment program for out-of-state law enforcement personnel and expanding scholarships for law enforcement training. The fallout from the BLM riots was not limited to criminal justice, and the movement toward critical race theory gained steam. DeSantis criticizes CRT as a left-wing academic discipline that falsely claims the United States is founded on white supremacy and argues that American institutions are mere camouflages for racial domination. He provides examples of how CRT has been abused in schools. Ron DeSantis discusses the perversion of American principles in education through critical race theory, CRT, and the 1619 Project. He highlights various instances of indoctrination in schools, such as Buffalo Public Schools teaching kindergartners about systemic racism and dead black children, and the Arizona Department of Education's Equity Toolkit claiming that babies show the first signs of racism at 3 months old. DeSantis argues that these ideologies, inspired by CRT, represent a perversion of American principles and are a recipe for exacerbating divisions in society. He also criticizes the New York Times 1619 Project, which distorts American history by portraying slavery as the primary reason for the American Revolution. DeSantis emphasizes that the American Revolution was not a pro-slavery event but rather a rejection of divine right monarchy, and the embrace of natural rights, which ultimately led to the end of slavery following the Civil War. Governor Ron DeSantis discusses various aspects of his efforts in Florida, including preventing the teaching of critical race theory, CRT, protecting women's sports, enhancing American civics education, and enacting reforms to counter big tech censorship and Chinese Communist Party, CCP, influence. He prioritized the Women's Sports Protection Act, which led to the NCAA changing its regulations regarding transgender athletes. DeSantis also emphasized the need for strong leadership, the importance of state governments in shaping policies, attracting businesses and residents from poorly governed states to Florida, and the effectiveness of Florida's COVID-19 policies in promoting individual liberty and attracting visitors. Additionally, DeSantis highlighted Florida's success in education despite spending less per pupil, attributing it to prioritizing students and parents over teachers' unions and maintaining in-person schooling during the pandemic. The governor also warned against the dangers of wokeness and urged a balance of evidence-based policymaking to protect freedoms and public health. His efforts to prevent the teaching of critical race theory, CRT, in Florida schools and protect women's sports. DeSantis argues that the Founding Fathers established a revolutionary project to establish a nation based on the fundamental truths that all men are created equal. But the full promise of the Declaration of Independence was not fulfilled for all Americans at the time. He asserts that the left's distortion of American history to serve their political ends is wrong, and that he took a stand against anti-American ideologues in Florida. DeSantis instructed the Florida Department of Education to adopt a regulation banning the teaching of CRT in K-12 schools, but critics claimed it was an attempt to prevent the teaching of slavery, racial discrimination, and the civil rights movement. DeSantis clarified that Florida law specifically required the teaching of those topics, and the regulation was not barring the accurate teaching of American history. To ensure that CRT remained out of Florida classrooms, DeSantis persuaded the legislature to enact a sweeping piece of legislation titled the Stop Wrongs Against Our Kids and Employees Act, or the Stop Woke Act. This law provides parents with a private right of action to sue a school district for violating state standards on critical race theory. DeSantis also discusses the issue of women's sports and the bizarre attempt to force women to compete against biological men who identify as women. He shares the example of two male athletes who identified as female and displaced biological women in Connecticut high school track and field championships. DeSantis argues that ignoring the biological differences between men and women harms the integrity of women's sports, and that competing in women's athletic competitions should be based on biology, not identification. When a bill to protect women's athletics was introduced in the Florida legislature, it faced opposition from corporations and the National Collegiate Athletic Association, NCAA, which threatened to cancel events in states that enacted protections for biological women in athletics. DeSantis calls the NCAA's bluff and urges the legislature to pass the bill and sign it into law. His decision to prioritize the Women's Sports Protection Act during Florida's legislative session in 2021. DeSantis, a former college athlete and father, believed it was essential to protect women's sports from biological males, even if it meant sacrificing other priorities. After the bill passed and was signed into law, Florida received no penalty from the NCAA, and the organization made clear it would not boycott the state. The bill's passage may have influenced the NCAA to change its regulations regarding transgender athletes in women's sports. Additionally, DeSantis launched an initiative to enhance American civics education in Florida schools, emphasizing the nation's founding principles and requiring the teaching of American civics in high school. The goal was to ensure students had a solid foundation in the core principles of the American Republic and understood the differences between American principles and other systems, such as communism. The importance of understanding America's political foundations and the role of civics education. He references Abraham Lincoln's warning about the declining respect for political institutions and the rule of law. DeSantis also highlights Florida's successful 2020 election administration, contrasting it with other states that faced issues with transparency and efficiency. He attributes Florida's success to removing problematic election officials and refusing to change election procedures due to the pandemic. DeSantis also mentions the issue of ballot harvesting, which he believes undermines the integrity of the election process. He criticizes California for allowing this practice and emphasizes the need to protect against it. DeSantis also discusses the vulnerabilities of absentee ballots and the importance of requiring voter identification when returning them. The issue of private money influencing election administration, specifically the $400 million poured into key states by Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg in the 2020 election. DeSantis explains that while it was not illegal, it represented an unprecedented transformation of election administration into an organ of partisan electioneering. In response, Florida enacted a series of reforms, including a ban on ballot harvesting, voter ID requirements for absentee ballots, and the establishment of an election integrity unit within the state government to investigate and prosecute election law violations. The unit was able to bring charges against dozens of individuals who voted illegally within 2 months of its establishment, vindicating the efforts to ensure the integrity of the electoral process for voters across the state. Ron DeSantis discusses the evolution of tech companies from open platforms to censors and their impact on political speech. He argues that as tech companies began to censor speech, they revealed themselves as the censorship arm of the political left, distorting the American political system. DeSantis explains that these companies have long enjoyed liability protections under federal law, but their censorship practices call into question the basis for these protections. He also mentions the Biden administration's failed attempt to establish a disinformation bureau and the need for legal frameworks to protect political speech from big tech censorship. DeSantis worked with the Florida legislature to enact reforms to protect Floridians from big tech censorship, recognizing that tech companies are different from typical corporations and more akin to common carriers. The reforms included protections for political candidates against being deplatformed. Florida's reforms aimed at holding big tech accountable for censorship and interference in elections. He mentions the need for transparency in social media companies' content moderation policies and allowing users to take legal action when unfairly discriminated against. DeSantis also criticizes the Chinese Communist Party, CCP, as a significant threat economically, culturally, and militarily, and discusses Florida's legislative reforms to end the CCP's influence in the state, including the ban on Confucian institutes. These institutes, according to DeSantis, are propaganda and influence operations designed to enhance China's soft power. Florida's proactive approach to combating Chinese Communist Party, CCP, influence and the importance of state governments in shaping policy and improving quality of life for their citizens. DeSantis highlights Florida's successes in enacting reforms against CCP influence, defunding law enforcement, and protecting against ideological indoctrination in schools. He emphasizes the significance of bold leadership and the Madisonian distinction between state and federal powers, arguing that states like Florida serve as laboratories for different governing philosophies and policy choices. The stark policy contrast between Florida and poorly governed states has led to a significant movement of individuals, wealth, and investment from those states to Florida, with Florida seeing the largest gain of residents and net adjusted gross income in 2020. Ron DeSantis discusses the reasons why Americans have been moving from Democrat-run states like California and New York to Florida. According to the U-Haul rental data, Florida, Texas, and Tennessee had the highest number of inbound moves, while California and Illinois had the most outbound moves. DeSantis explains that while taxes are a factor, Florida's superior tax and economic climate is a significant draw. Florida taxes lightly, spends conservatively, and regulates reasonably, while Democrat-dominated states like New York and California tax heavily, spend excessively, and regulate extensively. Florida's leaner budget and lower state burden, combined with better services and a more favorable business climate, have led to a mass exodus of high-income New Yorkers and Californians to Florida. From 2020 to 2021, Florida saw an increase of 10.3% in new business openings compared to California's increase of just 2.1%. Florida's unemployment rate averaged 3.3% from July 2021 to June 2022, while New York and California's unemployment rates were 5.1% and 5.3% respectively. Despite historical advantages, the vast divergence of policies implemented during the coronavirus pandemic has accelerated the trend of people and wealth fleeing to free Florida. Florida's contrasting approach to COVID-19 policies compared to liberal-governed states. Florida implemented a strategy that prioritized individual liberty, protected jobs, and ensured in-person schooling, while other states enforced strict lockdowns, business restrictions, and mask and vaccine mandates. As a result, Florida became the preferred destination for Americans seeking to escape these restrictive measures. Florida set records for domestic and international tourism in 2021, while tourist-dependent states like California and New York experienced significant declines. Florida's rejection of the biomedical security state and enacting a statutory ban on vaccine passports attracted visitors and businesses from lockdown states. Florida served as an antidote to the irrationality of lockdown policies, with people traveling from restrictive areas to enjoy normal life in Florida. This ability to live freely made a significant difference in the lives of many Americans, with numerous letters of gratitude from residents of lockdown states. The contentment and happiness of Floridians were noticeably higher than in other areas, ultimately aiming to provide a framework where individuals can pursue and achieve happiness. Florida's education system and how it outperforms states like New York and California despite spending less per pupil. Florida ranked first in the Heritage Foundation's Education Freedom Report Card and the National Assessment of Educational Progress. DeSantis attributes Florida's success to its ability to prioritize students and parents over teachers' unions, allowing for school choice programs and charter schools. He also highlights Florida's commitment to keeping schools open during the COVID-19 pandemic, while California and Illinois had fewer than 20% of their districts open for in-person instruction. DeSantis argues that politicians in these states prioritized the interests of unions over the well-being of students, particularly low-income children. Additionally, DeSantis mentions the safety and law and order differences between Florida and states dominated by leftist ideology, the dangers of wokeness and its impact on policymaking, using the example of criminal justice reform. He argues that releasing dangerous criminals from jail and refusing to prosecute certain criminal offenses does not achieve social justice and instead leads to increased crime rates and harm to communities. DeSantis also warns of the dangers of allowing ideology to triumph over evidence-based policymaking and cites the response to the COVID-19 pandemic as an example of this. He accuses elites of promoting hysteria, producing shoddy modeling and analysis, asserting certainty when nuance was called for, and allowing political partisanship to influence evidence-based medicine. The result, according to DeSantis, was the destruction of freedoms, hurt livelihoods, and overall harm to public health. He warns that the country must be alert to the dangers of turning over policy to a scientific technological elite and urges statesmanship to balance and integrate competing values and interests within the principles of a free society. Ron DeSantis discusses the early response to the COVID-19 pandemic and the role of Dr. Anthony Fauci in advocating for coercive mitigation policies. In March 2020, Fauci, who was the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, NIAID, and touted as the nation's foremost expert on infectious diseases, recommended mitigation measures such as isolating ill persons and voluntary isolation at home. However, he did not suggest closing entire industries or the country. Despite his expertise, Fauci was also an entrenched bureaucrat who had been in his position since 1984, demonstrating his political skills. In mid-March, researchers at Imperial College London produced a model that projected millions of non-nursing home coronavirus deaths in the United States and the potential for hospitals to be overwhelmed. Fauci and his colleagues, including Dr. Deborah Birx, spearheaded the drive for these coercive mitigation policies based on epidemiological modeling rather than empirical data. The Imperial College model, which understated the potential mortality and did not include deaths of long-term care facility residents or those who could not access health care due to hospital shortages, rattled members of the White House task force and led to the move for a shutdown. The stated goal of the 15-day shutdown was to slow the spread of the virus, but Fauci and Birx were in reality setting the country on a course of shutdown until eradication, a goal that was not possible to achieve. Once the shutdown was implemented, DeSantis and others began trying to figure out how to extend it. Governor Ron DeSantis discusses his approach to managing the COVID-19 pandemic in Florida and his criticisms of lockdown policies and experts like Dr. Anthony Fauci. DeSantis shares how he sought evidence-based recommendations, such as those from Dr. Jay Bhattacharya's study, to question the effectiveness of lockdowns and the accuracy of epidemiological models. He also criticizes the media and experts for their inconsistent responses to protests and stay-home orders. Despite opposition, Florida implemented a strategy focusing on minimizing risks to the elderly while avoiding the harms associated with shutting down society. Florida's response outperformed other lockdown jurisdictions like California and New York, and the state experienced a smaller increase in excess mortality compared to those states. DeSantis also discusses his decisions to keep schools open, oppose vaccine passports, and protect workers' rights during the pandemic. He emphasizes the importance of individual freedoms and economic opportunity and criticizes the media and political left for their inaccurate portrayals of Florida's policies, such as the Parental Rights in Education bill. DeSantis also shares his experiences with corporations, such as Disney and Coca-Cola, that opposed Florida's policies and the importance of corporate leaders standing firm in defending the interests of their customers and citizens. The controversial decision of some governors, including those in New York, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, to discharge COVID-19 positive senior citizens from hospitals into nursing homes. DeSantis explains that these governors did so to create bed space for anticipated hospitalization surges, but the policy resulted in the infection and death of many vulnerable elderly residents. DeSantis signed an executive order in March 2020 to prohibit hospitals from discharging COVID-19 positive patients into nursing homes, recognizing the potential harm to the nursing home population and the uncertainty surrounding hospitalization peaks and the fatality rate of the virus. The discussion also touches on the flawed modeling used to justify lockdowns and the long-term consequences of the shutdowns on American society. How he sought out evidence-based recommendations contrary to the lockdown policies advocated by Dr. Anthony Fauci during the COVID-19 pandemic. He mentions a study led by Dr. Jay Bhattacharya of Stanford University that found the prevalence of SARS-CoV-2 antibodies in Santa Clara County was much higher than the number of confirmed cases, implying that the infection was more widespread than initially thought. This insight led DeSantis to question the effectiveness of lockdowns and the accuracy of epidemiological models predicting catastrophic hospital collapses. He also notes that COVID-19 waves naturally self-flatten and that lockdowns did not significantly impact the trajectory of the waves. DeSantis emerged as a leading anti-lockdown official and believes that the objective of non-pharmaceutical interventions is to slow the spread to buy time to expand medical surge capacity, not to eradicate the virus. Ron DeSantis discusses the differing approaches to pandemic management between experts like Dr. Fauci and infectious disease expert Donald Henderson. Henderson's 2006 article, Disease Mitigation Measures in the Control of Pandemic Influenza, provided an honest assessment of various mitigation strategies for pandemic influenza. Henderson believed that communities respond best to epidemics when normal social functioning is least disrupted, and strong political and public health leadership is present to provide reassurance and ensure medical care services are provided. However, Henderson also acknowledged that mitigation strategies were not effective and came with significant costs to society. DeSantis criticizes the hysterical expert class for not following Henderson's advice in their approach to COVID-19 mitigation. He points out that experts and the media attacked Florida for keeping its economy open, requiring in-person education, and not imposing a statewide mask mandate. These experts endorsed mass protests following the death of George Floyd, despite the potential risk of COVID-19 transmission, while rejecting protests against stay-home orders. DeSantis argues that these experts were not going to save people, and that it was up to leaders to make evidence-based decisions that recognized the harms of mitigation efforts and maintained the normal social functioning of communities. Despite Florida's elderly and vulnerable population, the state experienced a smaller increase in excess mortality compared to New York and California during the pandemic. Florida typically ranked lower in terms of per capita COVID-19 mortality compared to other states, and nearly 40 states had higher per capita COVID-19 mortality than Florida. Florida's response to the COVID-19 pandemic and how it outperformed other lockdown jurisdictions like California and New York. The Committee to Unleash Prosperity conducted a study on state COVID-19 responses, and Florida was the top-performing large state and the sixth best overall, topped only by states with small populations. Florida's approach reflected the thinking of epidemiologists like J. Bhattacharya, Martin Korf, and Sunetra Gupta, who advocated for a strategy focusing on minimizing risks to the elderly while avoiding the harms associated with shutting down society. The Great Barrington Declaration, which proposed a strategy of focused protection, was met with hostility from the media and public health establishment, but represented a common-sense application of pre-pandemic response plans. Florida implemented a broad definition of essential business, refused to close beaches and golf courses, and instituted severe mitigation at the local level while keeping schools open. Despite initial concerns about hospital capacity, Florida's decision to revoke the order suspending elective procedures at hospitals and abandon federal guidance led to one of the lowest patient censuses on record. His approach to reopening Florida during the COVID-19 pandemic. He argues against the government's essential versus non-essential business framework, stating that every job and business is essential. DeSantis also shares how he facilitated the return of professional sports to Florida, starting with the Ultimate Fighting Championship, UFC, in Jacksonville. He overruled mayors who gave UFC a hard time and worked to bring back live golf and NASCAR. Florida also became the home of the NBA bubble, and theme parks resumed operations earlier than in California. Despite criticism from the media and experts, DeSantis maintained that Florida was not being reckless but rather prioritizing the normal functioning of society. The media's criticism of Florida's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic during the summer wave in 2020. Despite the media's claims that Florida's lack of restrictions led to the state experiencing the most significant COVID-19 increase, DeSantis explains that the virus follows a regional and seasonal pattern. He shares that he monitored the data daily and was certain that the summer wave would follow a similar trajectory to earlier waves. DeSantis faced immense pressure from the media, experts, and political opponents to shut down the state and impose a mask mandate. However, he believed that doing so would cause significant damage without any corresponding benefit for disease mitigation. DeSantis also criticizes the call for a post-peak shutdown as counterproductive and harmful to Floridians. He was also skeptical of the effectiveness of mask mandates and refused to impose one using government power. His decision to keep Florida schools open for in-person instruction during the COVID-19 pandemic, despite opposition from experts and unions. DeSantis explains that he reviewed data from March to April 2020 and believed that draconian measures would cause major damage to the economy and society with little impact on the trajectory of the disease. He also points to Sweden's experience of keeping schools open for grades K to 8 as evidence that schools were not major COVID-19 factories. DeSantis publicly stated that getting kids back to school was a priority, and he required all school districts in Florida to be open for classroom instruction 5 days per week for the 2020 to 2021 school year. The media and education unions criticized and sued him, but DeSantis maintained that it was in the best interests of Florida school children. Despite public opposition and media hysteria, the numbers of COVID-19 cases peaked and decreased by August. His administration's efforts to keep Florida's schools open during the COVID-19 pandemic and the state's opposition to vaccine passports. DeSantis shares that he had doubts about keeping schools open, but prevailed against the Florida Education Association in a lawsuit. Florida completed the 2020 to 2021 school year as one of the top states for in-person instruction, and students were better off due to the policy. Once the summer COVID-19 wave subsided, DeSantis resolved to be aggressive in keeping Florida free. He issued an executive order guaranteeing Floridians the right to work and operate businesses without penalties for violating pandemic orders. DeSantis also enacted a statutory ban on vaccine passports and prohibited private businesses from requiring proof of COVID-19 vaccination. These actions were taken to protect individuals' freedoms and prevent Florida from becoming known as a state with vaccine passports. DeSantis believed that the low risk of COVID-19 mortality among younger age groups outweighed the importance of corporations' ability to exclude people from society. Florida's reputation as a free state from COVID-19 restrictions contributed to a record-breaking year for domestic tourism in 2021. DeSantis opposed the use of COVID-19 shots as a political weapon and believed no Floridian should have to choose between a job and a shot they don't want. His decision to call a special session of the Florida legislature to enact protections for workers who did not want to get the COVID-19 vaccine. DeSantis criticizes President Biden and large corporations for trying to condition employment on getting the shot, which he argues does not prevent infection or transmission. He asserts that Florida stood out from other states like California and New York for protecting individual freedom and economic opportunity, and that Congress must conduct a thorough investigation into all aspects of the pandemic. DeSantis also reflects on his wedding at Walt Disney World and his subsequent political battle with the company over its response to the pandemic and business environment in Florida. The controversy surrounding a bill in Florida, which was inaccurately labeled as the Don't Say Gay bill by the corporate media and political left. The bill, named Parental Rights in Education, aimed to protect parents' rights to object to the imposition of sexuality and gender ideology in their children's lower elementary school classrooms. DeSantis was initially not fully versed in the bill's details but recognized the media's false narrative and reviewed the legislation. He was surprised to find that the left wanted to indoctrinate young students with gender theory and was responding to a nationwide trend of introducing such concepts to students at an early age. The bill provided for a flat ban on classroom instruction on sexuality and gender ideology in lower elementary schools and required age-appropriate sex instruction in other grades. DeSantis publicly fought back against the media's lies at a press conference, where he explained the bill's contents to a mostly supportive audience. The corporate media and left-wing activists opposed the legislation, and DeSantis resolved to make them own their stance on indoctrinating young children with gender ideology. Ron DeSantis discusses Disney's involvement in Florida's Parental Rights in Education bill. Despite pressure from activists and media allies, Disney, headquartered in California, risked alienating its customers and shareholders by taking a stance against the bill, which had no impact on its business interests in Florida. The bill, which opposed teaching sexuality and gender ideology to young children in kindergarten through third grade, was contrary to the interests of many parents and children, Disney's core market. DeSantis advises Disney CEO Bob Chapek against getting involved, warning that the company would face outrage and negative media attention regardless of its stance. He also shares past examples of corporations caving to the left's demands, such as those targeting Florida's tax credit scholarship program for religious schools. DeSantis emphasizes that giving in to the woke mob's demands is a mistake for corporate CEOs and that they should instead stand firm. Ron DeSantis discusses the controversy surrounding Georgia's election legislation and the corporate backlash against it. Major corporations, including Coca-Cola, Delta Airlines, and Major League Baseball, publicly opposed the law, claiming it would suppress voting rights, particularly for underrepresented communities. However, DeSantis argues that these corporations were falling in line with leftist narratives and that the Georgia law actually led to increased voter turnout in the May 2022 primary election. He also shares his experience with Disney's opposition to Florida's Parents' Rights in Education bill and how he remained firm in defending the rights of parents and the well-being of school children. Despite Disney's public relations hit and pledge to work for the law's repeal, DeSantis signed the bill into law. The episode highlights the perils for business leaders who cave to partisan narratives and the importance of standing firm in defending the interests of citizens. In the YouTube video, The Courage to be Free, Florida's Blueprint for America's Revival, Governor Ron DeSantis discusses Disney's loss of its special self-governing status in Florida and the controversy surrounding the company's stance on gender ideology in schools. DeSantis criticizes Disney for risking its family-friendly brand by aligning with the left's agenda and creating a conflict between fiduciary duty and political activism. He also discusses the role of large corporations and the media in advancing political agendas against the interests of most Americans, using Disney and the media's coverage of his administration's use of monoclonal antibody treatments for COVID-19 as examples. DeSantis argues that the media often operates in bad faith and promotes narratives divorced from facts, citing instances where his administration's response to the pandemic and allegations of data manipulation were misrepresented. He also criticizes the use of anonymous sources in news reporting and the media's treatment of Republican elected officials compared to Democrats. DeSantis emphasizes the importance of limiting the size and scope of government, bringing the administrative state under control, and checking concentrations of private power to revive a free society. Ron DeSantis discusses Disney's declaration of war on Florida's parental rights law and the company's shift from family-friendly entertainment to promoting left-wing sexual politics in its programming for young children. Disney's executives were recorded in a video conference promising to inject sexuality into programming and monitor the inclusion of trans, asexual, and bisexual characters. This came after Disney pledged to work towards the repeal of the law, which grants parents the right to have a say in what their children are taught about sexuality and gender identity in schools. Despite Disney's immense power in Florida politics for decades, its political vulnerabilities were exposed as the company could not easily move its massive footprint in Central Florida, and it enjoyed special state-granted legal privileges that no other company had ever received. DeSantis made it clear that he was willing to reevaluate and even eliminate Disney's special deal, as the company's activism impacted the rights of parents and the well-being of children, and it no longer acted in the best interests of the state of Florida. The strategic timing and execution of a special legislative session to address Disney's self-governing status in Florida. With the 2022 legislative session concluded, DeSantis knew he had to act quickly to strike while the iron was hot. However, calling a special session came with challenges, as the legislature could only consider issues included in the call establishing the session. DeSantis had an opportunity during the regular legislative session when he vetoed the congressional reapportionment map. He then called a special legislative session for the middle of April, limited to the enactment of a new congressional map. To tackle the potentially thorny issue involving Disney, he asked House Speaker Chris Sprowls to work on this in a tight circle with no leaks. They discovered several special districts enacted prior to 1968 that also deserved scrutiny. To expand the scope of the special session, DeSantis met with Senate Leader Wilton Simpson and briefed him on their findings. Simpson was unequivocal in his support and agreed to pass legislation in the Senate eliminating the special districts. DeSantis announced the expansion of the special session just hours before its scheduled start, catching Disney off guard and preventing its army of high-powered lobbyists from derailing the bill. Despite Democrats' claims of opposing special carve-outs for big corporations, they all lined up to support Disney's special self-governing status, demonstrating how the modern left has jettisoned principles in favor of power as long as corporations use their power to advance the left's agenda. Within a few days, the Florida legislature had passed legislation to address the pre-1968 special districts, including Disney's Ray Creek. In this section of the video, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis discusses Disney's loss of its special self-governing status and the significant financial and reputational damage the company suffered after taking a stance on gender ideology in schools. DeSantis questions why Disney would risk its family-friendly brand by aligning with the left's agenda, particularly regarding children's education. He explains that the left has pressured corporations like Disney to use their power to advance political causes, creating a conflict between fiduciary duty and political activism. The governor notes that employees' political demands and CEOs' desire for influence have contributed to corporations becoming major players in American politics and culture wars. He criticizes the old guard of corporate republicanism for prioritizing corporate interests over the national interest and argues that surrendering the political battlefield to militant left-wing corporations is not prudent. The role of large corporations and the media in advancing a political agenda against the interests of most Americans. He mentions Disney as an example and criticizes the media, particularly the national legacy press, for operating in bad faith and promoting narratives divorced from facts. DeSantis shares his experience with CBS's 60 Minutes attempting to dig for dirt on him during the COVID-19 response, and how his administration prioritized seniors for vaccine distribution, despite the media's preferred narratives. He highlights Florida's successful distribution of vaccines through various channels, including retailers like Publix, and the state's strong emergency response infrastructure. The state's efforts to distribute COVID-19 vaccines to seniors, specifically in Palm Beach County. He explains that seniors appreciated receiving the shots at their local Publix grocery stores, and the county wanted to distribute vaccines through public places due to the large senior population living near Publix locations. DeSantis met with local officials, including Democrat Mayor Dave Kerner, to increase vaccine availability for seniors. The governor debunked accusations from 60 Minutes that he had conspired with Publix to provide them with exclusive rights to distribute vaccines, stating that other pharmacies, including CVS and Walgreens, had been providing vaccines before Publix, and that the state had reached out to them to help expand distribution points. The governor emphasized that the state trusted these pharmacies to finish their long-term care missions before helping with community distribution. The success of Florida's vaccination distribution program using Publix supermarkets. DeSantis initially tried the program on a trial basis in 3 counties and received positive feedback from seniors. He then expanded the program to Palm Beach County, where 90% of seniors live within a mile and a half of a Publix. The program's success can be attributed to the strong retail footprint of Publix. However, there have been criticisms that the program is a pay-to-play scheme. DeSantis denies these allegations and points out that Palm Beach County officials recommended the partnership with Publix. Democratic officials in the county also spoke out against the 60 Minutes segment, which they claimed was intentionally false. The segment tried to frame the program as a racial controversy, but DeSantis had opened a vaccination site in a predominantly African-American town months prior to the segment's airing. The state of Florida had also partnered with predominantly African-American churches and religious organizations for vaccination events. His response to the COVID-19 pandemic in Florida and the importance of early treatment using monoclonal antibodies. DeSantis recounts how CBS's 60 Minutes program attacked his character over their handling of a story, but the real damage was done to 60 Minutes' reputation. DeSantis criticizes the medical establishment for its disinterest in treating COVID-19 and allowing life to return to normal. He shares his experience with the monoclonal antibody treatment Regeneron, which he believes saved his life when he was infected with COVID-19. DeSantis set up treatment sites in Florida to make the treatment more accessible and generated publicity about its availability, resulting in over 150,000 monoclonal treatments administered and thousands of lives saved. Despite the success of the program, the media discredited it, particularly due to its use in treating President Trump. The media's coverage of his administration's use of monoclonal antibody treatments for COVID-19. DeSantis criticizes the media for attacking early treatments as anti-vaccine and smearing him as promoting the treatment to boost profits for Regeneron, the company that produces the treatment. He refutes these allegations as baseless and unsubstantiated, emphasizing that the treatments were purchased by the federal government and had no impact on Regeneron's bottom line. DeSantis also accuses the media of publishing misleading clickbait headlines that may have deterred individuals from seeking life-saving treatment, potentially costing lives. He recalls a previous incident where a fired bureaucrat's accusation of data manipulation was used to attack Florida's COVID-19 response, despite the facts ultimately not matching to the media. An alleged data manipulation controversy regarding COVID-19 data in Florida. A former employee, Rebecca Jones, claimed that she was ordered to alter raw data to make Florida's response look better. However, an exhaustive inspector general investigation later confirmed that her claims were baseless. Despite this, the media seized on Jones's unsupported allegations to discredit Florida's COVID-19 response. Jones, a lockdown advocate, made bizarre and politically motivated claims that made no sense, as the reporting of COVID-19 data is decentralized and cannot be altered by the Florida Department of Health after it is imported into the system. The media's response to Jones's allegations raises questions about their commitment to facts and truth, as they chose to publicize baseless conspiracy theories to fit their preferred narrative, rather than holding a fired employee with a poor track record accountable for her false claims. The media's behavior reflects a sad and predictable industry that prioritizes advancing a partisan narrative over journalistic integrity. Ron DeSantis criticizes the use of anonymous sources in news reporting, specifically citing the Trump-Russia collusion conspiracy theory as an example of media-driven hysteria that relied heavily on unsubstantiated information from anonymous sources. DeSantis argues that major news organizations, such as the New York Times and the Washington Post, have a business model that thrives on the use of anonymous sources to spread political gossip and innuendo, and that the Trump-Russia narrative was the most serious charge ever leveled against an American president with no substantive evidence to back it up. He also accuses these media outlets of producing false reports based on anonymous sources, such as the New York Times article claiming that members of Trump's campaign had repeated contacts with senior Russian intelligence officials, which was later debunked by FBI Director James Comey and Special Counsel Robert Mueller. DeSantis argues that these media outlets have evolved into something akin to state media, protecting the nation's ruling class and Democratic elected officials instead of holding them accountable. He also criticizes the Pulitzer Prizes given to reporters for deeply sourced coverage of Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election, arguing that these reports were based on anonymous sources and were often false. Ron DeSantis discusses the media's role in politics and how they have treated Republican elected officials compared to Democrats. He references the 2012 presidential debate where Candy Crowley interjected during a discussion about the Benghazi attack, and how the media's response was different when a Republican was involved. DeSantis argues that the media will lie and smear Republican officials for years, but will give them strange new respect if they become useful in advancing a new narrative. He also criticizes the media for editorializing about subjects and hiding behind what experts say to validate their preferred narrative. DeSantis recommends that Republican parties should not allow corporate journalists to moderate their primary debates and instead sponsor debates with conservative media moderators. He also notes that younger generations of corporate journalists are even more agenda-driven and believe their role is to transform America into a progressive utopia. DeSantis concludes that the media no longer have the same sway they once had, and conservative viewers and Republican-leaning audiences have more power than Republican elected officials in delivering their message directly to voters without biased interference. Ron DeSantis discusses James Madison's warning about the danger of oppression and the concentration of power in post-constitutional arrangements. Madison, following the drafting of the Constitution, recognized the defectiveness of human nature and the potential for powerful interests to abuse their authority. He observed that the post-revolution experience of state governments had shown that legislative authority could dominate at the expense of individual rights. To prevent this consolidation of power, the framers structured the Constitution to divide power between three branches of government and reserved most authority to the state governments. However, over the years, there has been a massive concentration of power in the federal administrative state, which is not readily accountable to the people. This concentration of power has made individuals less free and empowered elites who reject core American values, exacerbating divisions in society. To revive a free society, it is necessary to recognize how things have gone wrong and understand how to set society on a better course. This includes limiting the size and scope of government, bringing the administrative state under control, and checking concentrations of private power. The power of the purse, as identified by Madison, is a powerful instrument for reducing the overgrown prerogatives of the other branches of government, but this power has fallen by the wayside in the modern Congress, which has effectively placed the government on autopilot through the routine use of continuing resolutions and omnibus appropriations bills. In the YouTube video, The Courage to be Free, Florida's Blueprint for America's Revival, Governor Ron DeSantis discusses the abdication of Congress's responsibility to rein in the federal bureaucracy and the resulting entrenched deep state that undermines the constitutional structure. He criticizes the politicization of federal law enforcement and intelligence agencies, using the example of the alleged targeting of Donald Trump. DeSantis also highlights his use of the line-item veto to foster accountability in government and protect taxpayer interests. He discusses Florida's response to federal mandates during the COVID-19 pandemic and his actions to protect jobs and individual rights. Additionally, DeSantis addresses the accountability of Florida's government and the threat to freedom posed by the rise of woke capital and the imposition of environmental, social, and governance (ESG) criteria on society through business. He emphasizes the importance of staying true to one's convictions and pursuing a strategic approach to governance within the constitutional system. DeSantis also shares personal experiences, including his wife's battle with breast cancer, that have inspired him to fight for individual freedom and opportunity for future generations. Throughout his tenure as governor, DeSantis has faced opposition from media outlets and big corporations, but has managed to win historic electoral victories by standing firm on important issues and delivering for his constituents. Ron DeSantis discusses how the modern Congress has abdicated its responsibility to rein in the federal bureaucracy by forfeiting the use of the power of the purse. DeSantis explains that continuing resolutions and omnibus bills have proven inadequate to discipline federal agencies because congressional leaders have avoided shutting down the government to wield the power of the purse. Instead, Congress has defaulted on its legislative responsibilities by delegating difficult policy questions to administrative agencies. The result is an entrenched bureaucracy with minimal accountability, which reflects one particular view in society rather than society as a whole. DeSantis argues that this so-called deep state undermines the constitutional structure and hinders the ability of a president to faithfully execute the laws. He also criticizes the bureaucracy for wielding power over others and imposing its will on a vast swath of society. DeSantis contrasts this with Reagan's time when the federal establishment had run amok due to liberal central planners' pie-in-the-sky designs and lack of real-world experience. In this section of the video, Ron DeSantis discusses the transformation of the bureaucracy into a weaponized tool for one particular faction of society, using the example of the U.S. intelligence community's alleged targeting of Donald Trump. DeSantis recounts how Trump was warned about potential reprisals from the intelligence community and how the Obama administration had previously weaponized the IRS against conservative nonprofit groups. The Russia collusion investigation is cited as evidence of the politicization of federal law enforcement and intelligence agencies, with officials such as Peter Strzok and Kevin Clinesmith falsifying information to obtain surveillance on Carter Page. DeSantis argues that these agencies have become aligned with the media and the ruling class, and that their actions depend on the target. He then shares an example from his own experience as governor of Florida, where he worked with the legislature to hold a provider of services for domestic abuse victims accountable for misusing taxpayer funds, demonstrating how a legislature can use its authority to protect the people against waste in government. His use of the line-item veto to foster accountability in government and ensure taxpayer interests. He set records for budget vetoes, totaling $3.1 billion by his fourth year in office, which provided leverage against the legislature and held agencies and contractors accountable. DeSantis also used his veto power to ensure compliance with the Constitution, specifically in regards to unconstitutional racial gerrymandering in Florida's congressional map. Despite political pressure, he vetoed the proposal and called for a special legislative session to address the issue. DeSantis emphasizes the importance of state governments protecting their interests against federal overreach, as seen in Florida's fight against COVID-19 vaccine mandates, Florida's response to federal mandates during the COVID-19 pandemic, and his actions to protect jobs and individual rights. When the federal government issued mandates, Florida legislators went into special session to codify job protections against these mandates. However, the Supreme Court upheld some of these mandates, putting jobs of medical professionals in jeopardy. Florida law provided them the ability to opt out, but the federal government threatened to withdraw funding if Florida did not survey healthcare providers about vaccine uptake. DeSantis prioritized protecting jobs and healthcare system over federal funds. He also discussed the importance of states checking federal overreach and holding local officials accountable. During the pandemic, DeSantis overruled locally imposed restrictions and suspended a Soros-backed state attorney for Hillsborough County for neglect of duty and incompetence. Despite criticism, DeSantis argued that his actions were necessary to protect the rights and livelihoods of Floridians. The accountability of Florida's government and the threat to freedom posed by the rise of woke capital and the imposition of environmental, social, and governance (ESG) criteria on society through business. DeSantis argues that corporations politicize the economy and exert a pervasive influence on society, particularly through the imposition of woke ideology in the workplace. He also criticizes big tech companies for their censorship of dissenting views and their violation of the First Amendment. Florida's government, DeSantis asserts, is more accountable to the electorate than the federal government, and he has taken steps to protect people from the imposition of leftist ideology, such as the Stop Woke Act and legislation to combat big tech censorship. DeSantis argues that the notion that private corporations do not impact people's liberties is erroneous, and that Florida's laws represent an attempt to protect individual freedom and the ability to participate in public debate. The potential consequences of the environmental, social, and governance (ESG) movement on important policies, particularly in the energy sector. He argues that the ESG movement, which encourages corporations and asset managers to consider social and environmental factors when making investment decisions, can have a devastating economic impact, especially on low-income people. DeSantis also highlights the need for constitutional accountability and the importance of treating corporations as political actors when they use their economic power to advance an ideological agenda. He proposes several solutions, including prohibiting the state's pension fund managers from using ESG criteria when making investment decisions, recovering the state's proxy voting rights, and enacting term limits for members of Congress. DeSantis also emphasizes the need for a more accountable executive branch and the importance of the legislative and executive branches working together to protect individual freedom from stridently ideological private actors. He concludes by emphasizing the importance of staying true to one's convictions and pursuing a strategic approach to governance within the constitutional system. The cost of exercising leadership in modern America, using his experience of facing attacks during the coronavirus pandemic as an example. DeSantis explains that as a governor who aggressively pursues policies that defy leftist ideology, he has faced consistent and erroneous attacks from corporate media, activist groups, and big tech. He emphasizes that a leader must be willing to take these hits, as he was able to save millions of people's livelihoods in Florida by taking strong stands against draconian coronavirus policies. DeSantis also shares a personal story about his wife's experience with breast cancer, which underscores the importance of standing by one's convictions even when faced with adversity. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis shares a personal experience of his wife's battle with breast cancer and how it inspired him. He talks about the overwhelming support they received from people across the nation and how it boosted Casey's spirits. DeSantis then reflects on the significance of Arlington National Cemetery, where he sees the tombstones as the most powerful symbols of the sacrifices Americans make for their country. He emphasizes that these sacrifices are essential for preserving freedom and opportunity for future generations. DeSantis also discusses his first term as governor, where he rejected relying on polls and took an active approach to leadership during the coronavirus pandemic. He emphasizes the importance of courage in facing challenges and fighting for one's principles. His administration's effective policies in Florida and the historic electoral victories achieved in the 2022 elections. Despite facing opposition from media outlets and big corporations, DeSantis stood firm on important issues, leading to increased support from Floridians. The state's political landscape had typically been close, with razor-thin margins in major elections, but DeSantis managed to win by a landslide, earning a 20% victory margin. This success was attributed to the positive political climate, the registration advantage Republicans gained during his administration, and his ability to win over various voter demographics, including Hispanics, women, and Black voters. The election results demonstrated that doing good policy can lead to good politics, and DeSantis encourages Americans to lead, have the courage of their convictions, and deliver for their constituents to achieve political success. Governor Ron DeSantis expresses his gratitude to the people who have supported him in his career, particularly during his tenure as governor of Florida. He acknowledges the crucial role of his staff in turning his vision for the state into reality and credits their dedication and hard work for the successes of his administration. He also acknowledges the contributions of Eric Nelson from HarperCollins, who provided valuable feedback and oversaw a team of literary professionals in telling the Florida story. Additionally, DeSantis thanks his longtime friend and lawyer, Bob Jeffries, for his counsel and assistance throughout the writing process.